Hi, my name is Bruce Farrington, and today's presentation is Ling Eaters and Other Strange Fish, Quirky Stories and Characters from Sodus Point. The premise of this presentation is a simple one. Every village has quirky stories and characters, but Sodus Point has had more than its share. So what exactly is a ling eater? A ling is a type of dogfish that has a connotation similar to a carp, definitely not a high-end fish. People from Sodus Point were given this nickname in the 1940s. It was not meant to be complimentary and drew attention to our decidedly blue-collar roots in those days. Quirky characters in our village go all the way back to the founding families. One of the early tales tells the story of a pair of identical twins, Amy and Levi Ellsworth. We know that Amy enjoyed a good drink or three at the local tavern in the early 1800s. When sufficiently inebriated, he would turn to a bystander and say, "Am I Amy, or am I not Amy? And if I'm not Amy, then who in hell am I?" June 19, 1813 was a tragic day for our village as local farmers and militia fought a brief skirmish with British invaders. The battle, however, was not without its humorous side. Charles Eldridge was heard to cry out from the bushes, "I am killed! I am killed!" Examination showed only a slight flesh wound in his neck. During the runaway, after the skirmish, Major Farr and Lieutenant Nathaniel Merrill played a series of dodges, a sort of hide-and-seek with each other in the woods, each thinking the other an enemy. Farr got so tangled up in the woods that he did not find his way out until morning. The origin of Christian Holler Road. Christian Holler Road is an east-west road that is approximately 3 miles southwest of Sodus Point. Arch Murrow, in his book The Ridge Ontario's Bloom Country, relates the amusing story behind the naming of this road. A locality in the neighborhood is called Christian Hollow, although to the pioneers it was Christian Holler, because back in 1823, early settlers there became obsessed with the idea that the end of the world was at hand. Led by a man named James Sargent, who was a local gristmill owner, they even fixed the hour. When the fateful time came, they assembled prayerfully, the men in their sober Sunday best, the women in their brightest shawls. Among them was one doubting Thomas who allowed that he would just meander over to the Geneva Road and miss the whole thing. He did, and when the hour of doom had passed without Gabriel's trumpet, this skeptic went back there and said, "I told you so, and you should hear the Christians holler." The Tale of the No-Name Cheese. In the 1920s, Perry Messenger was just starting his Hell of a Good Cheese company in Sodus. He used to send free samples around to churches and civic groups to advertise. Each bite-sized chunk of cheese would have a flag in it stating, "You are eating a hell of a good cheese." Several trays of cheese were donated to the Sodus Point Methodist Church for a church dinner. Ruth Krause, who was in charge of the dinner, saw no problem with the trays of cheese, but she underestimated how prim and proper the pastor's wife, Mrs. Van Hee, was. When Mrs. Van Hee saw the flags, she spent the afternoon cutting out the word "helluva" from 200 flags, which now cryptically stated, "You're eating a blank good cheese." Everyone at the dinner wondered what in hell, if you would pardon the expression, had been cut out of the little flags. This secured for the company Hell of a Good Cheese some of its best word-of-mouth advertisement, much better than the printed word. It may surprise you to know that in 1912, a Lyons fisherman caught a swordfish in Sodus Bay. Swordfish are a saltwater fish, so how is this possible? In 1912, the Montreal locks had not yet been built, so fish could swim unimpeded from the Atlantic down the St. Lawrence River and into Lake Ontario. Sometimes these fish made it as far south as Sodus Bay. Imagine the surprise of E.G. Streeter when he was fishing with minnows and was nearly pulled overboard while trying to land the fish. The fish was put on display in the front window of the Myers restaurant in Lyons and attracted a good deal of attention. From the 1930s to the 1950s, we had the perfect storm for quirky characters in Sodus Point. This was due to a large extent because of all the blue-collar jobs in our area caused by the railroad, the coal ships, the coal trestle, and the Genesee Malt House. A combination of railroad workers, coal trestle workers, sailors, and Genesee brewery workers thrown together in many local beer joints created what many now consider the perfect storm. One of Sodus Point's most beloved characters was Old Tom, who came into town in the 1920s and stayed here through the 40s. He was loved by both old and young alike. Old Tom, whose real name was Tom Jones, was an old black man. He didn't know his age and told people his first job was working at the malt house, which he did part-time. Old Tom loved the ladies, beers, and cigarettes. He would mooch cigarettes whenever he could, and he would light them from matches he hid away in his hair. Old Tom did odd jobs around town and once found $300 worth of coins in a kettle. He told people it was the most money he ever had. He would save newspapers all year long so that he could cover himself during the cold months to stay warm. He was especially loved by the children of Sodus Point. He had a trick that he would perform at the pier. Old Tom would light a cigarette, roll it into his mouth, and then jump off the end of the pier. He would stay underwater for about 10 minutes and then resurface. Climbing back onto the pier, he would take the nub of the cigarette out of his mouth, which he explained that he had smoked underwater. The crowd of children would applaud wildly at this seemingly impossible act. Tom never let on to the children that there was a hollow space under the pier where he smoked his cigarettes after diving off the end of the pier. Old Tom really shined at all the local parades. He would dress up in animal skins, attach a chicken bone to his nose, and become the wild man of Borneo. Secreted inside a cage, the children would cautiously approach this apparition. As they came close, the wild man of Borneo would rattle the cage and growl at the children. They would then scream in mock terror and jump back from the cage, only to repeat this process 30 seconds later. If you were not born in the 1930s through the early 1950s, you may not be aware of the wild man of Borneo. As kids growing up then, everything we knew on this subject we learned from Spanky and our gang.
How you feeling, Uncle George? Hello, Uncle George. Hello, Uncle George.
Eat 'em up. Yum, yum, 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 eat 'em up. Eat 'em up, yum, yum. Yum, 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 yum. Yum, yum, eat 'em up. Eat 'em up. Yum, yum.
He looks like a gorilla ate me.
The sad demise of old Tom, as told by Chris Arney. One day we came down to see him, and he was still lying on a rope sleeping. We woke him up to check on him. He said, "You're looking at one sick puppy." He was in bad shape, so Oscar and I got Gene Cook. He called someone in the health department, and they came down to check his condition. They took him to a county nursing home and put him in an oxygen tent so he could breathe better. Somehow he got a hold of a cigarette in that oxygen tent. Whoever gave him the cigarette probably didn't figure that he would smoke it because he didn't have anything to light it with. However, Tom reached up into his hair and took out a match that he had hidden. He scratched the match and it lit. The oxygen tank blew up and the explosion killed Tom. Tom, to this day, Sodus Point misses you, especially the kids. Parades just aren't the same without you. Uncle Max and the Horse That Drank Beer. Of all the quirky characters in Sodus Point's quirky history, Max Gross, pictured here, otherwise known as Uncle Max, was undoubtedly the quirkiest of them all. The following story comes to us courtesy of Frank Gross, who is a lifetime resident of Sodus Point. He relates the story of his Uncle Max and his faithful horse named Dick. Uncle Max was a colorful character who in the 1960s and 70s lived on Morley Road and could often be seen around town wearing a checkered shirt and hip boots. The reason he wore hip boots was that if he caught an illegal fish, he could slip it down there out of sight of a game warden. The other hip boot was used to store alcoholic beverages in the early version of a man's purse. Uncle Max worked on the coal trestle and had the nickname of Toggle. There were two prerequisites when you worked on the coal trestle. You had to have a nickname and you had to like to drink. Unfortunately, Uncle Max's fondness for drinking meant he no longer could drive a car. What's a guy to do? This is where Dick comes in. Dick was not only his best friend, but also his drinking buddy and designated driver. The fact that Dick was a horse did not deter Uncle Max in the least. Uncle Max would ride Dick to work each day and kept him in a shanty near the malt house. When the need arose after work to visit a local watering hole, as it often did, Uncle Max would saddle up Dick and he would ride his faithful steed off into the sunset. One of Uncle Max's favorite stops was Ray's Bar and Grill, affectionately called the Bucket of Blood, which was located on Santel Street not far from the malt house. Uncle Max would enter Ray's through the front door, and Dick would enter Ray's through the back door. Bottles of beer would be unsnapped and thoughtfully placed on the bar for Dick. Dick would grab a bottle from the bar and, tilting his mighty head back, guzzle the entire bottle. Although not much of a conversationalist, Dick could hold his beer better than Uncle Max, and at the end of the night would still have his wits about him. At the end of the drinking session, Dick would bend down on two of his legs, and the other patrons would lift Uncle Max onto him. Dick would then proceed home, and at the barn, Dick had been trained to operate the simple latch on the barn door with his mouth. Inside, Dick would bend down once more and deposit Uncle Max in a conveniently placed pile of hay where Uncle Max's wife would find him the next morning. Uncle Max was more than a horse whisperer. He trained his pigs not to eat food until he gave them the signal. Another story about Uncle Max involves his homing pigeons. He would send them over to the Canadian steamship office across the lake via steamship bearing messages. They would then fly home to Sodus Point with return messages. As far as we know, this was Sodus Point's first introduction to airmail. He also taught his dog to climb a ladder and accompany him on the roof of his house. Uncle Max also would put a piece of meat on his dog's nose and trained him only to eat it once Uncle Max gave the signal. Even if he left the room, the dog would wait. This brings us to the story of Uncle Max and the UFO. To the best of our knowledge, this is the only reported case of a UFO in Sodus Point. And this story comes from us from another one of Uncle Max's nephews, Fred Harrington, who grew up in Sodus Point in the 40s and 50s. One morning around 3 a.m., my mother wakes me up and tells me there is a UFO hovering up by Uncle Max's house and to go investigate it. When I get up there, I can see a light at the top of a big pine tree and I hear Uncle Max's voice. I yell up to him and say, "Uncle Max, what are you doing up there?" Uncle Max is obviously intoxicated with a flashlight and yells down to me that he is teaching Smokey, his dog, to climb trees. Sure enough, I see Smokey halfway up the tree, slowly climbing the tree branch by branch. Uncle Max could teach animals to do anything. Another fond memory he has of Uncle Max is that he always carried a pocket full of butterscotch candy to give to any children he met. Remember that Uncle Max worked on the coal trestle and wore the same clothes for extended periods of time, so as a result the candy was covered with a thick layer of coal dust. You had to wipe off the coal dust and then unwrap the candy to eat it. The story of Uncle Max's crow. Jim Gallagher was also a nephew of Uncle Max. He remembers that Uncle Max taught Jim the Crow to talk. Uncle Max's wife was named Rowena, but Uncle Max always called her Bubby. He soon had the crow incessantly saying, "Bubby, Bubby," over and over again. When Jim Gallagher and Max went hunting, they once took Jim the Crow with them, but soon found out he would not stop saying, "Bubby, Bubby," in a loud voice, scaring away any potential game. Jim the Crow was also taught to say another phrase. Max would come out of his house in the morning to go to work and say, "Good morning, Jim," and the crow would answer him with a "Good morning, Max." One night, Max was driving home in his beat-up car wearing a top hat that someone had given him the day before. His car had no taillights, so Max was using railroad lanterns placed in the rear of the vehicle. A cop, seeing this and knowing that Uncle Max was not supposed to be driving, proceeded to pull Max over. Recognizing Max, the officer sternly told him that he should have a friend with him to drive him home. Taking off his top hat, out popped his crow, to which Max exclaimed to the stunned officer that he indeed did have a friend with him. No ticket was issued. Glenn Procius, who is another lifetime resident of Sodus Point, also has fond memories of Max. He tells how Max would sometimes come down to his farm and grab his electric fence and hold onto it while being shocked. Max would then exclaim that he did not need to go to a fancy medical clinic when he could get his shock treatments for free. There are many other stories of Uncle Max involving trained ferrets, chickens, etc., etc., but I think you get an idea of why we think of Uncle Max as the quirkiest of the quirky characters of Sodus Point. The Curious Tale of the Piano in the Back of the Truck. Ray's Bar and Grill was located on Santel Street near the Malt House. Sporting a jukebox, it also boasted live entertainment in the form of a very old and heavy piano. The piano was often played by Frenchy Leclerc, who was a big, strong Quebecois who sometimes worked for Stu Sill. He also worked as a deckhand on the Fontana, which was a large coal freighter that made a daily 16-hour circuit between Sodus Point and the Oswego power plant. On a number of occasions, usually after heavy drinking, the patrons of Ray's Bar and Grill would lift the piano onto the back of a pickup truck, and as they drove it around town, Frenchie would serenade the folks downtown. At some point, it was decided to donate the piano to the community center. Once more, the piano was loaded onto the back of the truck for the short ride from Santel Street to the community center. Alas, it was on this fateful trip that tragedy struck. As the truck went around the four-way corner onto Bay Street, the piano rolled off the back of the truck. It played its final musical note as it smashed into the pavement in the middle of the street. Sadly, another 60s musical legend came to an untimely demise. This time not because of sex, drug, rock and roll, but rather taking a corner too fast. We can only imagine the thoughts that went through Frenchie's mind as his budding musical career laid broken in the middle of Bay Street. Perhaps one anguished "Sacre bleu" escaped his tormented lips that night.
Okay.
So I was curious as to what the least.
Billy Boomerang, also known as John McMahon, was Sodus Point's only world champion. He held the world record for most consecutive catches of a tossed boomerang for many years. He grew up in Sodus Point and then moved to Padre Island, Texas, where he became an icon, and even to this day is still a legend down there. He was featured on a segment of On the Road with Charles Kuralt many years ago.
Of course, find only the illusion of freedom. Back in Tulsa or Wichita or someplace, there's a time clock waiting for them. John McMahon, 38 years old, came here years ago, thought about that time clock back home, and decided to punch out forever. That left him free beside the sea, with only the bothersome little problem of how to support himself. The solution to that came to him out of the thin air. He became, as far as we know, America's only happy-go-lucky, full-time, freelance boomerang salesman.
These here, this one here was made by Dr. Lauren. It's one of his little super looper models. It's a plastic model.
Back when he was a carpenter's apprentice in Sodus Point, New York, back when he worked as an airplane mechanic and a tugboat hand, John McMahon was a nobody. Now he's known all the way from Port Isabel clear up the beach to the Mansfield Jetty. Everybody calls him Billy Boomerang.
These little models, they run $4.
Business consists of bragging to the tourists about his records.
I did my first record that summer, 129 catches. That was in 1972.
129 in a row.
At that time. And then 2 years later, I went 155, and then I went 172, and then I did 388.
388 times you threw that thing and caught it every time?
Without a miss.
How'd you feel on the 389th?
Well, I slipped it out of my hand wrong and came in slow on me. When they do that, that's where you're going to miss it, because it's hard to catch a slow-moving boomerang. I'd rather have it come in fast. I didn't think about doing it at the time, but I figured if I went to 100 straight catches, I had a chance. And it was just one of those days when the wind was perfect, and I was in the right mood, I had the right boomerang, and that's all it took. I've never tried for that record since, because that's going to be a tough record to try to beat.
Billy Boomerang knocks the tourists out.
Well, look at that. There you go.
Do people buy boomerangs?
Oh, lots of them. And everybody learns how to do it. Okay. Stand right out here where I can watch you.
Okay, is that how I hold my hand?
Yep. Okay. Send the wrist. Keep loose.
Like that?
Snap. Snap.
As boomerangs fill the air above Padre Island, Billy Boomerang has become a man with nothing to worry about, except all his students who haven't learned their lessons.
The main thing when you throw is to hold it properly. This is 90%. The improper way people do it, they throw it backside. It's flat-sided. If you throw them this way, they won't come back. Throw them like a frisbee, they won't come back. And you never throw a boomerang into the wind. And the main thing when you throw is don't think about it. Take your mind off of it.
What's tough to do?
Now, it's the most misunderstood sport in the world, but yet it's the easiest one to learn. It's easier than a frisbee. Actually, Ben Rule calls it the thinking man's frisbee.
The thinking man's frisbee. Billy Boomerang makes his wares of oak, birch, and mahogany like delicate wood carvings and sells them like hotcakes.
You have to be careful what you buy sometimes. They may look good to you, but just because they got painted design doesn't mean they're going to work. It's something new every day. It's a different experience. It's not the same old day after day grind behind the drill press or behind the hammer and so forth like I used to do, construction. It beats it all to pieces. I like what I'm doing. It's a good, healthy living. You can go out here and surf, do a lot of skin diving in the summertime, ride the kayak out there and surf on the waves. What I like is being my own boss and independent. You don't have to live by the clock.
You'll never get rich.
I believe I am richer than a lot of people because I'm happy. But still, no, if I had my choice to go back working for the other man again, I'd never do it. Not as long as I live, because my business gets better every year.
We envied John McMahon his free life by the sea, but we left him and headed north. You know how life is. You have to make a living.
There are many other quirky stories of Sodus Point that I don't really have time to go into. For example, there's the story of George Torrey, who built rum-running boats in his house on the bay and then tore down a wall in the spring to launch them. There was the lady who was known to do her laundry, and because she had limited amount of clothing, she would hang her laundry out in the front part of her property wearing only an apron. There's a story of the man who lived in a barn with a cow, and he died in the crapper, and they had to push the door in to get him out. But these are all other stories for another time. Like I said, our town has more than its share of quirky stories.